For the first time, I decided to plant some wheat in my garden and then try to make some bread from that wheat. For planting, I used red 5 wheat and white Sonora. I got 3 packages of each, and each package said that it had minimum of 500 seeds and around 13 grams. So right here in the bags, I have 40 grams of each type of seed. And this was not that much of seed to start with. So for planting, I actually use the earthway seeder to spread it more evenly for the space that I left for wheat planting in my garden. I planted it in mid-May, and a week later it sprouted, and this is how it looked. It seems like there's not that much wheat, but in 2.5 weeks, you can see that the green is covering the whole plot. A month after that, we already had a lot of green heads. Another month later, the wheat started to turn yellow. There's still some green ones, the ones that grew a little bit later. So I waited for another 2.5 weeks to give those green ones a little bit more time. And that's when I started the harvesting. So it took me 103 days to grow spring wheat. I did plant winter wheat in November, and it's still growing right now. I'll probably do a comparison video of spring wheat versus winter wheat once I'll harvest the winter wheat. So be sure to subscribe to the channel if that's something that you're interested in. But right now, let's take a look at the harvesting of spring wheat. I said that I planted 2 types of wheat, and right now at the harvest time, you can actually tell them apart. So the wheat with the lighter heads is actually red 5, and the wheat with red heads is actually white Sonora wheat, which I found pretty interesting. You might be able to see some grasshoppers on the wheat, and we did have a pretty big grasshopper population this year. Harvesting the wheat is pretty simple. I didn't have a hand sickle, so I just used a kitchen knife. Just make sure it's sharp. To cut the wheat, I just grabbed as much as I could with my hand and cut that bunch down and put that in a pile. So it would be easier to tie that pile for me. I placed a string on the ground before I started piling the wheat, and after the pile was big enough, then I just tied it and started a new one. It took me under an hour to cut all of this wheat down. After it was all cut, I laid the wheat on wheat control fabric for 7 more days to give extra time for the berries to lose some moisture. After 7 days, I started threshing the wheat, separating the berries from the wheat heads. Now, I found that this is probably the most time-consuming part about wheat harvesting. I did try several methods for threshing. Rubbing the heads together by hand or through a metal mesh gives you the best yield from the wheat, because you can see when you got all the berries out of the heads. But putting the wheat into the bag and rubbing it inside the bag does make it faster for you to get the berries out of the heads, but you'll still be left with some berries in the heads. Now it was time to clean out the berries from the shaft, and I started by filtering through a mesh to get the bigger pieces out. After those pieces were out, I could start winnowing. So the idea is to use wind to blow out the shaft, which is lighter than the berries. If you don't have wind, then you might use a fan or something like that to do that. From all the sheaves of wheat that I harvest, I was able to produce 8.5 kilograms of wheat, which is almost 19 pounds. And if you remember, I started with 80 grams. So I was able to get 100 times more grain than I planted. It was a satisfying result in terms of yield. The next step is to make some flour so I can make some bread. I use this mill to create the flour. If I lift the metal lid, you can see how the mill works. It uses 2 stones. One stone is stationary, and that's the stone that you feed the grain through. It has a cutout in it, and the other stone is attached to the motor, and that is the one that is rotating. You can control the gaps between those 2 stones to create a finer or coarse flour, because the flour comes out through that gap. So if you have a smaller gap, you will have a finer flour. So to make some flour, you adjust the setting of the fineness you want, close the metal cover, turn on the mill, and put as much wheat berries as you want to mill, and it's gonna start milling and making flour. flour goes down into the bottom metal container, and here is the end product. You can sift the flour to get rid of the bran, but you can also leave the bran in there and make whole wheat bread. I tried to use this flour for a couple different bread recipes, and here's the bread that I made with yeast. For this one I used the red 5 wheat, and you can see it's darker, and for this one I used the same recipe but used white Sonora, and it has more yellowish look to it. I also made some bread with sourdough. All the breads taste really good, but out of these I like the sourdough better. I want to try out using this flour for some other recipes, and maybe I'll share how it's gonna go in some future video. Overall, I enjoyed the experience of growing wheat and harvesting by hand. I actually planted some winter wheat as well, and I'll be harvesting that one in a couple months. That is it for this video, but here are some videos that you might be interested in. Be sure to click on the like button and subscribe to my channel, and I'll see you in the next one.